Inspirational Creatives, episode 287. Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and a very warm welcome to Inspirational Creatives. With the last interview of this series being December 2019, who would have known what was to come this year? Casting my mind back, I certainly didn't expect any of the events of 2020, but here we are, 10 months living with lockdowns, COVID, and all sorts of new challenges and opportunities. So it made sense to me, in order to reconnect with you and to bridge the gap of 2020 with this podcast series, by inviting back onto the show small business growth expert and a mentor of mine, Neil Foley, from the Business Growth Club. I haven't had much chance to catch up with Neil one-to-one since we last spoke last year, so I thought this would be an ideal opportunity to capture our conversation live, so to speak, as I'm really interested to hear his thoughts and how recent events have shaped and impacted our world as creative beings and business people. And I know for many listeners, and for you, the listener, listening to this today, you might be thinking about some kind of career change, maybe going out there on your own, setting up your own business or becoming a freelancer. And I couldn't think of anyone better to bring onto the show to share some ideas, some advice and some tips with you than Neil. So Neil, very warm welcome back to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for inviting me along, Rob. And no pressure, you've set me some pretty high tasks there, but we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, great. So I guess let's start here. Maybe tell me a little bit about what your experience of this year has been, because when we last caught up on tape last year, 2019, December 2019. I remember that interview and our chat then quite vividly, but I'm pretty sure that I had no idea of what was to come at that time, and that was sort of mid-December 2020. What's your experience of this year been?
It's been such a ridiculous year, isn't it? And it's gone really quickly, which has surprised me somehow, because I've been more isolated than most in terms of doing stuff online. And I do remember a friend of mine saying to me in about January time, late January, to tell me to stock up on food. And said, actually, you know what, we've got a crisis coming. You need to stock up on some food because I can see what's coming. And I remember talking to people at the time thinking, well, I have no idea what he's talking about. And it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And everybody sort of took the mick, really. But so clearly there were people who were aware that things were going wrong in China in particular, in Wuhan. But it's hit us as a tsunami. I think there's been 2 or 3 stages to this year. There's the initial shock of lockdown, and economics is a hobby of mine and something I've always been involved in the financial sector, the financial world, if you like. And I remember some of the initial figures that came out where people were predicting that, you know, GDP might drop by 8, I think the figure was 8.7 or 8.9%. And I couldn't get my head around that, because that's colossal. That's beyond comprehension. And blimey, here we are, and actually it's much worse than that. And yet at the time you think, how on earth do we survive with this? So we had the initial shock. A lot of businesses, I think, just literally shut up shop. We've had the second period, because there was so much government support. Now, a lot of people fell through the cracks, and a lot of the self-employed fell through the cracks, but a lot of people had support. We now know there's a money tree, so the government every government has come up with astonishing levels of financial support, all with borrowed money. And I think at that stage we entered what I would call the phony war. So actually, for quite a few businesses, things weren't too bad. You'd furloughed your staff, so your staff costs have gone, probably not paid your rent, or your landlord had said, OK, we'll give you a stay. Not every landlord did, but most did. And the stats are something like around a quarter of people have paid the rent that was due. So 3/4 haven't. Had a holiday on your rates, If you've got premises, probably had a grant from the local authority funded by central government. So all in all, look, actually got more cash in the bank than you've ever had. But that doesn't mean you've got a viable business. And the phony war, I think, is you could see being there and then is now starting to end. We're now entering here we are, on the 8th of October. So the tsunami is on the horizon now, with furlough in the UK ending at the end of this month. What replaces it is nothing like as generous. And a second wave of COVID. So I think this is the really difficult period is now going through into the early part of next year. Because clearly we have to live with this virus. It isn't going away. That virus is done. So I think we've had 3 different stages. And now I think there's a bit more reality, probably a bit more fear about now than there was earlier. Would be my take. That was a very long-winded answer, Rob, but I think that would be my take on it. Now that reality's hitting, now you should be worried. Now is a dangerous period.
So what do you think is going to happen, or what do you see happening with businesses and small businesses in the next 6 to 12 months? What's the reality of that, in your opinion?
I think they need to be very, very focused on what is it the consumer wants. And the consumer doesn't want just digital and everything. There's a danger of thinking everything is digital, and it isn't. But people quite clearly want a mixture. You need to be careful because there will be a lot of companies going insolvent. So if you're in the B2B market, then you need to be very careful as to who you're dealing with. Over here in the UK, we have something called prepacks, which happen quite often. So companies can offload the debt and buy back the assets at a very reduced price and start with a clean slate. That's happened a lot, and a lot of very big businesses have done it, and quite a few small ones as well. It's controversial, but it's legal if done right. The laws may tighten, but at the moment it's a very dangerous scenario. So you need to be very careful who you're doing business with. You need to be very clear on your proposition. Cash is king, always has been, and you need to keep cash in the bank. And I guess you need to be thinking in terms of how do my customers want to engage with me? What is it they want? Because ultimately that's the only thing that matters. We can try and plan things and put schemes in place and processes, but actually it's what the customer wants. Yeah. So there's probably no better time to engage with your customers and talk properly to your customers and support them, encourage dialogue and conversation. But I just think there'll be a lot of survivors, a lot of people who thrive. But you can't just carry on doing business the way you always did, because I don't think that will probably happen. And there'll be a lot of changes in technology, won't there?
Yeah, absolutely. The term cash is king, or the phrase cash is king, I've often heard that. For our listener, could you describe a little bit more about what you mean by that? Because, I understand it as a business owner, but there may be people here that they've never got into business before, perhaps, and we'll get more into that shortly. But I'd love to get your take on what you mean by that and why it's important.
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? It's one of those expressions. What it doesn't mean is your transactions should be in cash, because clearly most aren't. They're going to be digital. What it means is if you've got money in the bank, it gives you options. So if you've got free cash, in terms of cash that isn't allocated to something else or isn't just waiting to pay a tax bill or a supplier or something else, if you've got surplus cash in the bank, it gives you options. It gives you a chance to maybe do some very good terms when you're buying something, to say, actually, I don't need credit terms, I can pay you very quickly. Sometimes people will give you a discount if you pay quickly. In particular, as we go through into a tightening environment, sometimes people are desperate for cash. And if you say, look, I'll pay this invoice today rather than wait 30 days, but I want a discount, sometimes people will give it to you. So cash is important for that. Cash is also important because it just gives you breathing space. Because one of the things that happens, and I heard an example of this yesterday, is when we're in a really tough economic environment, people will often cut costs and cut prices as a way of securing business, because I just need cash flow. because I've got to pay the staff at the end of the month, or I've got a VAT bill. I just need cash. I'm up to my overdraft limit or whatever it is. One way of getting quick cash is to reduce your price so you get a deal. Doesn't matter if I make a profit. I'm not sure they're right, but that's what they think, and I can understand the logic. I just need cash. So if you're competing with them, suddenly you think, how do you do that? I don't want to lower my prices and have a race to the bottom. So if you've got money in the bank, you don't have to take deals that don't make sense to you. So you can walk away from a deal and say, you know what, I won't do it at that price because there's no margin in it, and what's the point? And we're just moving money from A to B. So cash gives you that chance to also survive a little bit if suddenly you have a bad debt. If you have a very lean period, it might mean you need to up your marketing spend, because traditionally people cut back on marketing when times are tight, but that's normally a mistake. So it gives you a chance. So cash just gives you options. And it's another one of these trite expressions, if you like, is you go bust, bankrupt as a business very, very slowly, and then all of a sudden exceptionally quickly. It tends to be a sort of sleepwalking into disaster, and then it happens very quickly. Something goes wrong, somebody doesn't pay you,
and that's it. Yeah.
And I've known businesses do that and go bust extremely quickly, from 1 minute looking okay to suddenly losing one or two big clients, suddenly having a gap, and suddenly thinking, oh my goodness. And the banks will. I've always said this, another silly, the banks will give you an umbrella when the sun's shining.
Yes.
And actually, and you can't blame the banks necessarily, because they want security, but you can't rely on other people. If you've got cash, you don't have to rely on anybody.
Yeah, there's self-resilience that comes into it there with cash in that sense. You reduce your dependency is what I'm hearing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. You should have answered that question. So you've summarised it in one sentence.
Well, I needed to hear what you had to say to kind of get there. But yeah, that's great. No, that's really useful, Neil. Very interesting. And it's a curious one to me, because what you were saying there, I think we touched upon the danger of discounting in our last conversation. So in the previous episode, essentially, we talked about that and the danger of that discounting. And I can see how having cash in your account can prevent you from accepting what could be a poor deal for you, really.
Yeah.
It gives you a little bit of confidence,
yes,
I suppose, in order to be able to say, well, actually, if we're not going to reach the right terms, actually, I can hang on for a bit because I'm not desperate. Is essentially where I am.
And that we'll see more of that in the months to come, where businesses will be desperate and they'll do stuff for any price. And that can be very disheartening for you, because you're thinking, how do I compete with this? You just have to hold your line, be very strong in terms of what makes you different, what are the reasons why people should be dealing with you, and you get what you pay for. Because inevitably, when it's a race to the bottom, people cut costs and cut corners because they have to, and they're desperate. So you don't want to be in that game. Digital is the interesting one as well, in terms of people have used digital. We touched briefly on it. People have used digital a lot more, of course, during 2020. But that it isn't a panacea. Digital transformation is one of these terms that's often used. It's a bit of a buzzword, isn't it? It doesn't mean anything as far as I can see, because everybody uses digital in some form or another, and we're all trying to transform into being more efficient and giving a better customer service. When you look at the stats from people like McKinsey's and PwC and some the really big players, the vast majority of businesses fail to transform themselves successfully using digital.
Interesting.
Most digital transformation exercises have failed. Figures are well over 80% fail.
That's interesting.
And it's because it's a tough, because you think it's easy, but it is a tough ask. Culturally, it's a tough ask for the business. Most of us don't get IT, and a lot of customers don't necessarily want it in the way that you're portraying it. So I think digital isn't the panacea. It's part of the solution, but it isn't the solution.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because a lot of the stories I've heard this year is where large organisations, most specifically, they've had challenges over the number of years about, around home working and working remotely and that kind of stuff. And it's been fascinating to me to see how some large organisations that were, I wouldn't say completely against it, but pretty reluctant to promote it or encourage it, have suddenly adopted it. I've had to adopt it to survive because of this, all the events of this year. So it's demonstrated, in my opinion, it's demonstrated to me that if an organisation really needs to do it, they can do it. And it's not as bad as they think they can do it. But you're sharing with me a really interesting perspective, which I haven't seen yet, which is actually there's probably a bunch of businesses out there that have failed at doing that. And it's just put them out of business because they haven't been able to pivot or adapt quick enough or easily enough. They just don't have, they didn't have the fundamental capability to be able to make that shift.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen that here in the UK with, we've got one of the biggest retailers, Primark, owned by Associated British Foods, very successful retailer. At the bottom end, these are cheap and cheerful products, making the conscious decision to say, we're not going to go online. And that seems extraordinary. But they've clearly, they're a very successful business. They've clearly worked out that actually, you know what, we still think there's an appetite for things to be physical, face-to-face in the sort of price range that we offer. And who would bet against them? Whereas everybody else is racing to go online. And of course, when you're racing to go online, you're if we think in the UK and the white space, you've got companies like AO.com who have been an online from the word go and have worked it out. Of course, you're playing catch up if you're trying to beat AO.com.
Yeah.
Which is why companies like John Lewis and various other ones are really going to struggle. And we're seeing that. So companies need to be very clear what it means from a customer viewpoint. And it isn't about cutting costs. One of the interesting figures I saw the other day is Amazon, of course, brilliant at digital. So they looked to digital as a way of releasing people from doing mundane tasks. And they had about 7,000 employees they were able to redirect to do far more interesting work about the customer experience. Now, that's classic Amazon in terms of investing for the future, because that's what Amazon has always done, and which is one reason why it's so successful. Whereas some businesses sort of think, well, actually, I could cut out 7,000 staff. Look at the cost saving. Wow, that's fantastic. You only get that saving sort of, if you like, in the short term, whereas Amazon is saying, no, people are really important in the business, but if we reutilize them to come up with a better customer experience, we get long-term growth. I think Amazon, that's one reason why Amazon's so forward-thinking on stuff like that. And don't see many companies doing that. They're thinking of it in digital as a way of cutting costs. And I'm not sure that's right.
So looking to the future then, and perhaps a little bit more positively, because I think that, a little bit of optimism goes a long way at this time for many people.
Yep.
And particularly for our listener, if they're living in what feels like very uncertain circumstances right now, particularly from a career, a lifestyle perhaps, and an income perspective. There's a book you mentioned, which I'm eager to get hold of, about the future. Would you like to talk a little bit about that book and what you've learned from it so far and what we can be thinking about to broaden our mind a little bit, perhaps?
I would be very positive about the future. I'm an eternal optimist anyway. But I think we have every reason to be optimistic about the future. The first part of this podcast may have sounded a bit downbeat. I would say it's more realism than downbeat. But the reality is, as human beings, we have extraordinary capability to be innovative, to look to take advantage of things. There's always winners and losers. I certainly wouldn't want people to be pessimistic in any way, shape or form. We can touch on one of the problems with mainstream media, isn't it, is the fact that bad news sells, bad copy sells. They're not going to tell you the good stuff.
Yeah,
but actually, the world is pre-COVID. The world was better than it had ever been. There had never ever been a better time to be born anywhere in human history than now. COVID will have put that back, but viruses are here to stay. You just have to live with them in some form or another. We get better at treating them, and there won't be a vaccine anytime soon because it's not the way the vaccines work. But we'll learn to live with it. So. The way I see things as the opportunities for people who are thinking, what do I do now, is the book you mentioned is called The Future is Faster Than You Think, which is written by some two techies looking at how what they would call the convergence of technology. So we all remember TV programs talking about flying taxis and this is what we're going to be doing in the future,
Yes,
etc.,
yeah.
etc. And it's very easy to say, well, how come that hasn't happened? And what's going on? But when you look at companies like Uber, actually Uber are investing massive amounts of money in flying taxis. And you know what? They're actually talking with the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA in America, to say, how do we do the air corridors? They have the technology. There'll be small pods that will fit 4 people in. The driving forces that, one of them is in Los Angeles, where the congestion is so appalling, it can take you hours to get to work. They've got projections as to what cost they need to get this down to make it viable, because otherwise it will just be your executives, but actually they can make it viable very quickly. They would estimate this is going to happen in a couple of years. So the technology exists.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is if you add in quantum computing, that's such a game changer that it's just beyond most people's comprehension. So the future will be very different. What it might mean is that there's a lot more use for creativity. There's a lot more use for people who are good with their hands, good people who understand human interaction and how we work as human beings. The more mundane stuff, I think, is difficult to see where the future is for that. Doesn't mean you can't make a career out of it or a living out of it, but the world is changing rapidly. But it's always been changing rapidly. But quantum computing makes the huge difference to my mind. And as an old boy, that doesn't make a lot of difference to me, but I think it does for people like you and others to say, actually, the world will change.
Yeah.
But what that means is all the barriers have gone.
Yeah.
And at the moment, that's one of the fascinating things I think about the modern age, is there are no barriers. There used to be barriers. There used to be barriers if you were depending on your social class, depending on your race, depending on your education, depending on unions and closed shops, and you couldn't do this because you hadn't got that. Now you can do anything you like. And technology enables you to do anything you want to do to almost anybody in the world. That's talk about being an optimist, but that's fantastic, isn't it? So you can do anything you want to do. And from a business viewpoint, find a niche, work out what it is, see who else is doing it, see where you think you're slightly different. What's to stop you having a go?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into that a little bit more, Neil, because I'd love to hear your thoughts and guidance for our listener in terms of, I imagine they could be in a situation now where they might be fed up with their current career, lifestyle, or their line of business.
Yeah.
Maybe they've experienced some of the stuff that we're seeing a lot of this year, which is, furlough, redundancy, perhaps. They may or may not have a little bit of cash. But what are your thoughts and ideas in terms of where to get started, how to get started, bearing in mind that our listener might have no experience whatsoever in terms of going out there on their own, quite daunting, perhaps feeling that's actually just not even a possibility. What hope can we give them actually that if they've got an idea or a dream, or there is perhaps something they might like to do off their own back as an individual to begin with, perhaps? What are your thoughts and ideas around that, Neil?
I see this a lot, and we've always seen this a lot, where people are thinking, I'm fed up with my job, or I'm in an environment where I can't think of going anywhere, or I don't enjoy it, and life's too short to be doing stuff you don't enjoy. Sometimes you have to do grunt, but, most of the time you need to be doing something you love doing, like you are and I do.
Yeah.
The classic mistakes and the things that people shouldn't do, and then we'll talk about what they should do.
Yeah.
What they shouldn't do, and it happens quite often, is people worry about branding. So they think, well, I've got this idea, so what am I going to call it? What's the name of this particular venture I'm thinking of? And they spend ages talking about the name. Often they come up with a stupid name, which doesn't bear any relation to what the business actually does. They'll think about branding. They'll spend ages on a logo. They'll think about a website. Actually, some business cards. I need some business cards. So they'll go all around the periphery of the main thing. And none of that is important, because you'll never have a brand, not a recognizable brand, because brands cost 7 figures to create brands and long time. And none of us have got that sort of money. And who cares? We're not going to go head to head with brands. What people can do, though, and should be doing right from the word go, is to say, who's going to buy what I'm thinking of selling? a product or service, nearly always it's a service. What are people, why would somebody buy it? What makes me slightly different? What do I know that people need to know from me? And we've talked about this before, but what's the niche? And the common mistake that people make, and it's entirely understandable, is I'm starting off, so I want to appeal to as wide a number of people as possible because I got more chance of getting some business that way. So, for argument, if I want to be a copywriter, so I've always been good with words, and I'm thinking, actually, I think I could do something with this. Well, I could do them for websites, I could do them for brochures, I could do them for leaflets, I could do them for, accountants or engineers who are typically quite difficult with some of the sales copy. And you end up thinking, I could do all of this. So that's what your proposition is. And what happens is, if you're shouting at everybody, nobody hears you. You need to narrow it down and say, well, actually, what I'm really good at, let's take the engineers bit. I have an interest in engineering. I'm technical and I like things like that. Actually, maybe engineers is my piece. Then when you're speaking directly to engineers saying, you know what, I've got expertise in your area, the engineers will listen if they need you. So you're shouting at somebody specifically. So it's all about the target marketing. And bottom line, everything is marketing until somebody's bought. So everything you can possibly do is about marketing. It should be about marketing your proposition and working it out. See what the competition are doing. Don't worry about them, but see what they're doing. What are they doing really well? In which case you need to be aware of it. But conversely, what are they doing which is actually they've missed the mark, they've made a mistake, they've got complacent, or as you often find, they've listed lots of things that they do, but they don't really. They're not specialists at it. So where's the little gap? And you're trying to look for a gap which is viable. Only as we know this from the Seth Godin stuff that you and I have talked about before, the minimum viable, people talk about minimum viable product, but what's the minimum you can get away with? What's the smallest pond you can swim in and be a big fish? I did a podcast a few months ago now with a guy who developed software. So software as a service. That's a really hard competitive space, massive. There's so many bright people out there producing astonishing software, very difficult to sell. So talking to him, he dominates a space with music teachers for reviews. Because I said to him, how on earth do you manage to make this work? And he said, it's not difficult. You just find a small space. And then you find multiple small spaces. So he had this reviews for music teachers who teach online. And he said the attraction of that is there's quite a few of them. And the second thing is, it's such a small niche that nobody else is going to go in it. And I have this space all to myself. And he's earning, six-figure income, just focusing on real niches and just going after them and being relentless in his pursuit of them. So I think that would be my advice, is to think, actually, don't spend oodles of money. You don't need to spend oodles of money. Forget your branding and your logo and the rest of it. Just what's your niche? Have multiple niches, have 2 or 3 niches, but have niches that you can talk to. And then I think you can just go and talk to them and actually be open and upfront and say, I've got an interest in this. I'm very, very good at it, but I'm new and I'm small. So would you give us a chance? Would you talk to me, please? Most small businesses are well supported by people as long as you're realistic. I did speak to somebody a few months ago, and it must have been last year, came up with this idea and said, right, he's got this idea and he's going to sell it to the NHS. And you have to say to him, you're stark raving mad, because the NHS will never, ever buy from you. Have you any idea of the procurement process in the NHS, the National Health Service? He said, no, I haven't looked at that, but it can't be that complicated. You go, really? The biggest employer in Western Europe, and you don't think it's going to be complicated? And the risk of somebody like anybody putting their faith in you is enormous. So why on earth should they do it? And certainly with public money, they're never, ever going to do it. So be realistic. So go, don't be silly. You're not going to be a unicorn in terms of, we've had this obsession with unicorns. Forget being a unicorn. You just want minimum viable proposition and the smallest pond you can swim in.
Again, for our listener there, that term unicorn, again, I hear it a lot. Could you describe what you mean by that in small business terms?
They talk about unicorns. I think the official if there is an official thing, is, companies that are worth $1 billion dollars or pounds. And they tend to be fintech type companies. They tend to be technology companies like Uber and the rest of it. So new kids on the block who disrupt existing models and can make themselves, the valuations be extraordinary. The cynic in me would say it's a bit like pass the parcel that you play as a kid. You can make extraordinary sums of money as long as when the music stops, you're not holding the parcel. So people often don't hold these long term. They think, actually, I'll offload this because one day or other, somebody's going to say, but what's the share? Because the idea is to go public and get some public money and get quoted on a stock exchange so that the founders and the early investors can get out with their money. The cynic in me sometimes says, it's the emperor's got no clothes on. And you hear this a lot. And it is something that's a Western thing. I don't know if we did touch on this on our previous podcast, that rather than thinking of your exit plan from the word go, just try and build a business that's got some longevity. Thinking of exit, and it makes sense once you're viable, because what you don't want is everything to be around you. But that's as far as it goes. But this idea that you're going to sell it for loads of money is just a nonsense.
Yeah.
Because it's probably not going to happen.
We're thinking there about building a sustainable business, something that creates an income and perhaps a lifestyle. I think that's some of the reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean feet up on the beach as well, because I recognise that a lot of people that want to get into this, actually they love working hard, but they want to work hard doing something that they get a return on. But not just from a financial point of view, but also from a kind of a well-being, a mental health point of view too, in terms of actually, I'm going to leave a nice legacy here, and or this work has meaning to me. It gives me purpose. It's something I jump out of bed to do each day versus reluctantly crawling out of bed to go and get stuck in traffic and then go to a job I don't enjoy.
Yeah.
But just going back a step here, Neil, there's a couple of thoughts I'd love to kind of get your take on. You mentioned marketing there and that being important, and you also mentioned your niche. Now, it may be that our listener has got no idea what their niche is. So going back even further, where would you start? How did you begin? I'd love to hear your story about, if I remember correctly, you worked and then you made a transition towards working for yourself. Can you remember that time and how you went about that?
Yeah, vividly. For me, it's very different than a COVID situation, but I was working in a corporate environment, was doing very well, thoroughly enjoyed it, was being exceptionally well paid, was on a very upward trajectory career-wise, and being marked out for what I thought was a significant long-term career. I never thought of leaving the company, really. What happened was I suddenly realised my mistake was that actually it was a very political environment, and I hadn't realised that. I thought you just got on with your job and did your best you could, and I was working 12, 13, 14-hour days and massively busy, but being very successful with it. Suddenly realised it was a political environment and got moved sideways against my will. I was just gobsmacked, really, and suddenly realised this future wasn't there, and I wanted something in my control. So in a fit of pique, I left, really. So you leave your six-figure income, and this was in the 90s, so it was good money, and all the benefits that go with it. You feel good for a little while, and then you think, what have I done? Because you've gone from security and safety to, I better live on my wits then. And so for me, it was about the political bit, thinking, actually, I want something that's in my control. I may or may not get back to those income levels. And actually, I did get back to those income levels within, it probably took 7, 8, 9 years to get back to that level. So there was no overnight success. There was just survival, scratching around for a living, and then gradually making more, and then realising that actually you can make more of a go of it. And then after you get a bit older, you realise that actually money isn't everything. So I don't make that sort of level of income now, and I couldn't care less. It's more about doing what you enjoy. In terms of if people think I've no idea what I could do, I suppose it's just do your research. Try and be honest with what you think you're capable of doing. Maybe ask some of your support network and your friends as to, what are my strengths and weaknesses? What do you think I should do? Too often you hear people go through life thinking, I don't know what I want to do career-wise. Well, just think laterally a little bit. So ask your friends, what do you think I'm good at? What do you think my role could be? And it might be you want to go and be a carer. We've had a lot more talk about caring society during lockdown, and they've been the unsung heroes of lockdown, really. So it might be you want to be a carer. Well, okay, that might be a step back in terms of income-wise, but who cares if it puts food on the table and fulfills you? Then, blimey, what do you want out of life? It could be you look at things like franchises, not to buy a franchise. I think you need to be very cautious of that. There's some very good franchises around. McDonald's is a franchise. So if you've got $500,000 and you want to go to the north of Scotland, you can probably buy them. But so there's lots of very good franchises around, but franchises can give you an idea. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of this, because there's so many. You can learn a lot from franchises just from having a look at them.
That's interesting, yeah.
And you can learn a lot from things like Udemy courses, can't you? Because that gives you an idea of what's out there. You think, well, I didn't even know that was a thing. I think if you're really unsure, then, and of course we're talking about doing things part-time to a large extent. And I wouldn't say, if you're at the stage where you're thinking, I have no idea what to do, going whole hog on something when you're in that frame of mind is quite a dangerous thing to do. So I would dip your toe in, find your niche. No reason why you can't do this evenings, weekends, or whenever, as long as it doesn't conflict with your current employer.
So try a few things out.
It's a very long-winded answer, isn't it?
No, it's a great answer, and it's really insightful too. I hadn't thought about franchises as a sort of a reference point, if you see what I mean, in terms of inspiration, perhaps. But going back to your own story and that time when you made that transition, and you said, you were sort of scratching around for a few years, which is kind of what I think you're suggesting there in terms of actually go out there, try a few things out. That makes sense. Don't put all your eggs into a basket. Even in my experience, and I've had to chop and change and pivot, as they say, many times, I think. I mean, it's now I can draw a line between what I do and what I first set out to do. But it was actually a very meandering journey to get there. And I tried lots of different things in lots of different ways. And it's subtle, actually, the spin. Coming back to the marketing side, it's a subtle difference in positioning that made a big difference in terms of like possibility and income and all the rest of it. But going back to that time, can you remember when you actually sort of found something that A, you got really excited about, and B, you could start making some money from, and how you happened upon it and what the opportunity was? And
I don't think there was any one point, Rob. I think it was more of a gradual thing. I think what quite often happens, I suppose you get a bit of luck,
right,
where suddenly you stumble across quite a bigger contract or something that actually you think, you know what, I think I could do this. You generate your luck in the sense you have to be active and busy and putting your name forward and getting knocked over and getting up again and saying, well, that's not a personal thing. It's just they didn't want my service, so I'll go and knock on a few more doors. So I think there's an element of luck, and I hear that a lot with people. I think it's Jack Nicklaus, wasn't it, who said, the more I practice, the luckier I get.
Yes, that's right.
And I think there's an element of that, isn't there, with it? So if you're active, if you sit back and say, well, somebody's going to find me, that isn't going to happen. Even if you've got the best website in the world, there's, I don't know how many millions of websites, you're not going to get found. You need to go out there and be active. So I think it was a gradual process. I don't think there was one point. There certainly were points where you suddenly thought, you know what, people actually think more of me than I probably think of myself, value me more, because we all suffer from imposter syndrome to one extent, or other, and the vast majority of us do. And those that don't actually are not people you probably want to talk to. So most of us have got this humour bit of thinking, am I doing the right thing? Am I any good, etc. And I think getting some positive feedback from people saying, actually, you know what, you're quite good at this, makes all the difference. And then what I did do as well is I studied my craft. Even once I was busy and making a very good living at it, I was always investing time, always trying new things, looking at new technology, new ways of doing things. Never kept things the same. So I was very keen to learn from people who were better than me, would talk to them. And that's something we probably ought to touch on, that most people are very, very keen to help.
Yeah.
So if you reach out to somebody, even in your sector, and say, look, I'm no threat to you, but actually this is, I'm a videographer for argument's sake, I'm no threat to you, I'm just starting off. Could we talk? How did you do it? What tips could you give me? What ideas? And by the way, are there any small clients that you've got that you no longer want to deal with? or when you get inquiries, etc. So we probably ought to collaborate a lot more than we should. Because most of the time, if you go out and say to somebody, look, I'm new and young, and can you help? Don't have to be young. That was a silly thing to say. But if you're just new, new to it,
young-minded,
most people will help.
Yeah,
most people will help. There's a fellow that I did a podcast with a couple of years ago, young guy in his 20s. Actually, a smart cookie. And one of his things was he wanted to learn from other people. So he wrote a very, very, very well-crafted email to a number of CEOs in Europe, which essentially said, I'm a young guy, I've had a business, I'm now in this period of thinking, what do I do with my life and the rest of it? I'd love to know about leadership, and I don't understand leadership. What does it mean? And I think, from memory, I'm right, he got interviews with 74 CEOs.
Wow.
And he wanted half an hour. Some of them spent all day with him because there's no threat and they want to help. Most of us want to help. If I came to you, well, I know you have helped me with audio. So that idea of reaching out to people saying, can you help, please?
Yeah.
Not give us a job, but can you help, please? This is what I'm thinking of. Have you got half an hour? And nowadays with LinkedIn, you can connect with anybody, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in my experience too, I found that actually that those early days of research, it did end up leading to pay work. Because when I was approaching people and asking them questions about what they needed and what their challenges were, and if I could solve those challenges, what would it look like to them? I do remember some sort of more informal conversations after that kind of more formal research that I was doing, them saying, well, if you can build that, let me know, because people are actually like, you've taken an interest in a problem that I've had to live with for a long time. So if you or anyone you know comes up with the solution, let me know, because we might be interested in buying it. So actually that what you're suggesting there could actually lead to you getting some traction with your idea and turning that into a business, which sounds fantastic, Neil. What else do you think you need when you're first getting started? So asking for help is one thing, certainly. We've talked about thinking about a niche, a market, an idea, something that ideally you're passionate and interested in. Coming back to that sort of longevity, you're probably going to stay in the game longer if it's something you love doing or you're deeply interested in. What else do you think you need? What do you see people looking for when they're first getting started? Perhaps the not so obvious things to think about, or it could be worth putting in place earlier rather than later, because they might help you along your way a little.
For me, it would be focusing on actions. So there are lots of support around. So our local enterprise partnerships here in the UK, LEPs, we call them. There's a number of those government quangos that are designed to support business. They're designed for bigger businesses, but small businesses. So there's lots of courses you can go on. You can get very busy coming up with courses and support networks, writing business plans, which is what everybody would say quite formally. You need to write a business plan. Think about what the next 3 to 5 years is going to look like. I would think that's a complete and utter waste of time. I would think the business plan should be, I need to find my niche. I need to do some research. I would have a business plan that is nothing more than a series of actions, which would say, okay, if I'm going to do this, what am I going to do on a day-to-day basis? And it might be that I have to reach out to 10 people every day. I have to have 10 conversations on LinkedIn, or via networking or virtual networking group, or via your local chamber of commerce, or finding people and reaching out and sending them a list, an email, crafted email, saying, I've seen your website, I like this, I thought maybe I could help on that. That, to me, is something that very few people do. That's exactly what you should do. It's a bit like saying, if you want to be a copywriter, well, write some copy. Decide the niche, write some copy for somebody and send it to them. Volunteer for a charity or whatever to say, actually, you know what, I just want to learn my craft. Can I give you my time for free or for a pittance? Because it would help you, but actually helps me, because then I can have some social proof from you to say, actually, Neil came along and did some great work for us. So for me, it's all about activity. And the more people, the more active you are, the more likely you are to get lucky, the more likely you are to hone your craft. If I said I was going to speak to 100 people over the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, with my offer, I may get 100 rejections, but I may not. I may get one person who says, you know what, you caught me just at the right time. What will happen is, but the first time I do it, I'll be very nervous, I'll stumble, I'll hate it. I'll get in a cold sweat. My mouth will go dry. By the time I've done 100, a lot of that will have gone because I've realised that's a stupid thing to say. Why did I say that? I've realised I needed a script, or I've refined my script. So it's all about activity, and there is no substitute for activity. The important thing from a mental health viewpoint, if you like, is what you do determines how you feel. In a business sense, it's not the other way around. And all too often it's, well, I didn't feel like it. Well, I haven't quite got that right. I haven't got my logo right. I haven't quite got my branding right. I haven't got this, that and the other right. Therefore, I didn't do it. Might be perfectly reasonable, but it doesn't make you feel better. What it makes you feel is actually you've dodged it. You've dodged the key question yet again. Whereas what you should be doing is to say, you know what, I got slapped down 50 times today. I got absolutely nowhere. But I had a blooming go. I'll put my head above the parapet, and I've had a go, and tomorrow's another day, and tomorrow, and it'll be the Jack Nicklaus thing, tomorrow I'm going to get lucky. And the chances are if you keep going, you will. So that to me is what people don't do, is say, I'm going to have an activity target. I'm not going to get hung up on designing stuff, etc. Just talk to people, engage with people. That's what it's all about. And that's when you'll learn, actually, this niche isn't going to work. Actually, you talked about pivot. Actually, it isn't this. Actually, there's something over here that somebody said. That's really interesting. Let's talk about that. Who are my mentors going to be? So I think there's tons you can do, but it's all about activity. If you're busy, you'll be fine.
That's really good, because there's no substitute for action, is there? I mean, you can think about this stuff all day in your head, but actually just going out there, having conversations. And the great thing is, I suppose, one of the things I was going to say is there's new opportunities and possibilities every day. That's something I realise, and particularly this year. I mean, so much is changing and so quickly. You really can wake up and it's a completely new day, because who knows what's going to happen today or what's going to be available to you today. And I think with that in mind, and particularly now that we're so used to connecting, as you say, like digitally like this, you can pack your day with calls and conversations with people, 15 minutes, 10 minutes here, there and everywhere. Ask lots of questions, as you're saying, and ask for help, ask for lots of questions, find out what people's challenges are and what ideas they've got in terms of what support they might need. And that could be something that you could essentially turn into cash, into a business in some shape or form. I want to ask you a little bit more about the future and going forward with business. But before I do that, there's something you touched upon there about it can be a long game. It is a long game. What do you do to remain motivated, but also to perhaps cultivate your patience? Because I feel that's still for me the biggest lesson here. I still have to be patient, waiting for that business deal or waiting for that opportunity to land. Like you say, you don't know when the luck's going to fall. You just got to stay in the game and keep taking action. But how do you manage that, Neil?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I think it's partly your personality. I tend to be an eternal optimist, so I'm lucky the most in that sense. And the danger of repeating myself, I think for me, it's about activity. Sadly, it comes back to nothing more complicated than that. To keep motivated is to keep going, keep investing. I'm still doing Udemy courses. I've got 3 on the go at the moment. Udemy courses are dirt cheap, aren't they? And there's some really talented people out there who put an enormous amount of information out there. I'm still thinking, how does that work? And I don't quite understand that. There's a new piece of software that's come out, and I'm thinking, that's interesting. You go on Udemy and blimey, there's thousands of people who've done a course on it, and I've only just heard of it. And you think, actually, I wonder if this could be the one. Could I invest some time? So I still do that. I still do Udemy every week.
Yeah.
I read a lot, but it's about activity. Bottom line is, when you're starting off, is trying to work out what your niche is, and you're only going to know that with feedback from prospects and from friends. The difficulty with friends, I suppose, is friends and family is that they want to protect you all the time, so they're going to tell you all the reasons why it won't work.
Yeah.
Which is for perfectly understandable reasons. But just to have targets that you speak to. It's the tortoise and the hare bit, isn't it? It's the slight edge bit by Jeff Olson, which is actually, it's just about doing stuff that is very easy not to do.
Yeah.
So, but just do the stuff that, and that means that 95% of people won't do it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like eating, isn't it? Losing weight actually isn't that tricky. Just don't eat so much.
Yeah.
It's not actually rocket science. There's millions of diet books out there and the rest of it. But of course, That's very easy not to do. To eat healthily, it's very easy not to do. And if I don't do that today, does that make a difference? None whatsoever. If I eat a burger today and tomorrow, will it make any difference to my health? Probably not. So that's the trap that we get into within business. If I don't make the calls today, and I don't craft the email, and I don't send 10 out and follow them up, or I don't make any LinkedIn requests and find something of interest, will it make any difference? No. But actually, if you don't do it for 90 days compared to if you did do it for 90 days, what's the difference?
Yeah.
Enormous. So it's activity over a short period of time for me is what it's all about.
That's great, Neil. I really like that answer. And also you mentioned a great book there, The Slight Edge by Jeff Olson, which I'm a fan of. That's brilliant. I think it was you and Oliver that I heard that.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And that's a great book. And that's all about just making lots of powerful small decisions on an ongoing basis, basically, because you're always making decisions. I think even not to make a decision is a decision in a crazy sort of way. So you kind of have to focus your mind more consciously on actually what's the right decision, what's the small decision that needs to be made now that's more positive than my other options. And then it has this sort of compounding effect over time where all of a sudden we find ourselves in the place that we want to be, like you say, losing weight or, starting ourselves up in terms of our business. So I think that's a fabulous answer, Neil. I really like that. I guess what's perhaps on the listener's mind right now, though, is like, okay, this all sounds quite good and I can go and explore this stuff. And I hear what you're saying about taking action on a daily basis rather than just about thinking this stuff. I think that's one of the big lessons I'm picking up on here in our conversation today, Neil. You mentioned you're an optimist and looking forward towards 2021 and everything that's going on now. Is now a good time really to be doing this stuff or thinking about perhaps starting up a business?
Short answer is yes, because there never is a right time. It's a bit like the Irish joke where you ask an Irishman, which is the route to Dublin. Well, if I was you, I wouldn't have started from here, sort of touch. There probably never is a right time, but circumstances forces you to take action frequently. With me, it was suddenly having a sideways move and having my career path sort of snatched from me that I thought sort of fit at peak. Some people, it might be redundancy. Some people, it might be worried about the long-term future of the company they're with. Could be a business they're in, they're already thinking, actually, this isn't going the way I thought. So there never is a right time, I don't think. I'm not an advocate of your back has to be against the wall. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, is like a lot of these truisms, is absolutely true.
Yeah.
But I don't think you need your back to the wall to make this work. There are some people who say, well, you need, some thought you need to go all in. Everything in, borrow money, invest everything you've got, because then you've got no choice but to take action because you're going to be forced to do it. That's a hugely dangerous thing to do. And actually, if you need to get you motivated, you need to go all in and risk everything, then I would question whether you're doing the right thing at all. You should be motivated because you can see the possibilities and you're excited that you make a difference and your service is really good. Not because, crikey, I've borrowed so much money that I'm about to lose my home.
Yeah.
Something's wrong with that. That's a different motivation, a different set altogether. So now is a great time.
Yeah.
There always is. The best time to plant a tree was yesterday. All these little cliches, which are pretty nauseating, but there's an element of truth in them to say, well, what's going to change next year? Because if you look at it, that's the other way of looking at it. What's going to change next year? The virus will still be here, because that's what happens with viruses. Almost impossible to see how you can have an effective vaccine in the short term, because the only thing you need with a vaccine, you can throw as much money as you like at it, but the reality is you need to know what the effects are in 2 years' time.
Yeah.
The only way around that is to wait 2 years. So we'll get better treatment, we'll have a better understanding, maybe we'll be a bit more sensible in terms of understanding how it spreads, maybe it'll morph, but it'll still be here. So if you say, well, I'm going to wait until COVID's gone, well, it may not go, or it may not go until 2022 or 2023. So what are you waiting for? What's the point in waiting? If you've got this desire, start exploring, start learning, start dipping your toe in, start talking to people. Because what's the worst that can happen is actually it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or you get feedback that says, you know what, I'm not sure that's quite right. What you will find is somebody else has done it already.
Yeah.
But don't get put off by that, because the world's big enough to cope with all of that. But you need to know if there's this niche, this idea, is there a market in it? Because it's not just about finding a gap in the market, it's about making sure there's a market in the gap. Maybe nobody's done this before for a very good reason. They might have missed it. Chances are there's some things you hadn't thought of. So do it now. What's that? I can't see the point in hanging around and waiting.
And I think the thing we perhaps haven't touched too much upon is actually it's a lot of fun, isn't it?
Actually, that's a very good point. It is fun. There's nothing more motivating than seeing something you're doing work. And actually, the other thing is you meet great people, don't you? Because suddenly your circle is much wider than in current work or current environment. That's the real joy in life, isn't it? The real joy in life is the relationships that you make.
Definitely.
And the difference you can make to your little world, your society, your community. As you know, that's a big driving force for me is to, it's making the local community, business community stronger, which means that we employ more people, we spend more money locally. We don't have to wait for central government because they're clearly going to run out of money before too long. Well, they've already run out of money, but they're going to run out of being able to borrow money before too long. So actually, it's a laugh, and who knows where it goes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you keep learning and finding different stuff. Nothing to stop you having 2 or 3 little businesses where you suddenly join up with somebody else and say, that's an interesting idea. Why don't we do something on that? And how did that work? And then, collaboration is the name of the game.
Yeah, collaboration. I love that, Neil. That's great. So what's next for you for the rest of 2020 and going into 2021? What are you going to be focused on and interested in?
I've helped a long-standing client buy another business. So they've taken the opportunity to really expand during COVID. It's a very sound business, so they're going to, that fingers crossed, should complete within the next week to 10 days. So I'll then help them embed themselves in the business, and that will take probably 2 or 3 months to help them get that going. For me, it's just more of the same. My network of very small business owners is supporting them, still doing the webinars, still doing some individual work. I've got more than enough work on the go. I still enjoy what I do. I'm still working maybe 10 hours a day because, if you're enjoying it, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I can't see the problem really. So yeah, for me, I worry about COVID and I worry about the state of the world and the rest of it. But the optimist in me says there's still some great opportunities out there. Human beings are still extraordinary. Yeah. And we'll create new things, and reading things like the future is faster than you think suddenly opens your eyes to say, wow, the world is going to change at a phenomenal rate with quantum computing alone. You add that with 3D printing and you think, wow, what does that mean? So it's an exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, it really is. That's great. And you touched upon it there. You've got your webinars, you've got the Business Growth Club. Where can folks find out more about that and learn more from you, Neil?
It's called businessgrowthclub.net. And I've done 19 modules that people can access for free. There's, probably 100 podcasts on there, loads of blogs. There's a ton of information on there designed for small and micro businesses who are looking to grow and need some help and guidance. It's a niche that I very much focus on. It's from if you were thinking of things from a pure financial perspective, it's a difficult niche because most small businesses haven't got a great deal of money, which is why they're ignored by a lot of people. But it doesn't mean you can't actually make a living by advising and helping them. And you get enormous satisfaction from the feedback you get when people learn from it. So businessgrowthclub.net would be the obvious place to go.
And any parting thoughts or advice for our listener today, Neil, before we wrap up?
I could be controversial to an extent, can I, Rob?
Of course you can.
I wouldn't pay any attention to the media, social media. The whole point of Facebook was to keep in contact with friends and family and your interests and the rest of it. There is a business angle to it that some people use extremely well. It isn't something I personally do. But don't pay attention too much to the media. We used to have a program over here. You're too young to remember, Rob. It was called Drop the Dead Donkey.
I remember it.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
Drop the Dead Donkey was about a newsroom where, in the absence of a lead story, they were going to talk about a dead donkey because, it's got the donkey, so everybody's got the R factor. It's got people who get upset and annoyed by it. So it's a great salacious story. And Drop the Dead Donkey is because something else even more salacious has come along. Forget the donkey. We're going to talk about this now. And there is a temptation to that. We're listening to news readers and everything on it. All of a sudden, everybody's an expert. They're expert in viruses. They're experts in diseases. They're expert in the R number, something that's quoted as if it's, a fact. So much stuff around them. And actually, you could slit your wrists if you listen to these people. And actually, they haven't got a clue what they're talking about. And they don't care, because it's the next story that they go on to. So I would look at some of, I'm not saying conspiracy theory stuff, but there's different views and everything. And actually, none of it, who cares? Because we can't do anything with it anyway. So just be sensible. When you understand the science, you realise that actually we're not even 100% sure what it means when you wash your hands. We have no idea of the number of bacteria that live in our bodies. Most of the bacteria in the world hasn't even got a name. So this idea that we know everything, so forget all that. Just do the stuff. Only worry about the stuff you can influence. Don't worry about the other stuff. The future is what we're going to make it, isn't it, ultimately? Working with the cards you've been dealt with.
Yeah. Fabulous, Neil. Thank you so much again for your time today, sharing your wisdom.
Pleasure. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes, where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there.